Welcome to TVBS Meeting Room, where we tackle global issues with a view from Taiwan. I'm your host, Wenqi Yu. Today's guest is Jessica Chen Wise, professor of China Studies at Johns Hopkins University. She's formerly with Cornell University. Jessica, in my view, is one of the most prolific scholars on US-China relations. She also tends to be more critical of the current hawkish US policy towards China and does not mince her words when it comes to criticizing the current Taiwanese administration's policy toward China. While not mainstream in the DC world, her view is widely shared by many longtime China scholars. So let's hear her views. Welcome, Jessica.
Thanks so much for having me.
Well, as a scholar, you also spent a year working in the State Department's policy planning office in the Biden administration. How was that experience and what were your learnings? How is that different from the academic world?
It was a really important experience, and I was grateful for the opportunity to help contribute. It's a really difficult set of challenges that the United States faces, not only vis-a-vis China, but also around the world. And so the opportunity to work with members of the Biden administration really helped open my eyes to the full range of issues around the globe and how relations with China factor into that. And so most academics really are trained and incentivized to study what is and not what should be. But working inside the government, you're constantly trying to think about what's the next step, what actions should we take. And so it was a really important and formative experience for me in trying to apply the insights that I've learned from my academic research and that of so many scholarly colleagues to try to understand how to better situate the United States given the many challenges that we face, but to do so from a basis of rigorous evidence and strategic deliberation. And that, I think, combination, of scholarly rigor and perspective, but policy relevance is the same kind of trajectory that I hope to remain on.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say, rather than studying what is, but more what should be, right? It's much more what is driving the agenda. And of course, a lot of it is there's politics behind it. And so after you left the government, pretty have been vocal or continuing to be vocal about the current US policy toward China. Can you share your main criticisms and what do you think the new administration, whether it's Trump or Harris, should do?
Well, I think the main challenge is that on both sides of the Pacific, the United States and China are both more prioritizing efforts to prepare for a potential conflict rather than efforts to find a way to advance our kind of mutual and respective interests without necessarily gauging success by how we're doing vis-a-vis the other. And so the Biden administration has done a number of things I think that are right. It has articulated kind of a vision for the world that is based on shared principles and not the idea of might equals right. And that is an important move, I think, toward articulating an affirmative vision of where we are going. But at the same time, there is rhetoric in Washington, and to say nothing of in Beijing, that defines success as sort of winning, implying kind of a winning that is beating the other, outcompeting the other. And I think that that kind of rhetoric leads easily to and contributes to the zero-sum mentality, which is especially, I think, prominent in the broader American public discourse and on Capitol Hill that makes it very hard to find a stable footing where American interests can be advanced. And so my main critique is that we need to be a lot stronger in developing the muscle of what we stand for rather than trying to outmaneuver or simply beat China.
It sounds like, from my own observation, that the objectives seem to have changed on both sides, right? The objective, prior to the Trump administration, whether it's the U.S. toward China or U.S. standing in the world, felt quite different than today's objectives. And so you almost have to agree to the objectives in order to develop a policy toward that. Would you say so? Especially, let's just focus on China for now. It used to be the default position is to embrace China, integrate China into the world, but now, like you said, it's about winning over China.
I think there's still a set of folks who are still of the belief that a China that's working inside the system is better than a China that's spoiling for a fight on the outside of the system. But to be sure, I think both Americans and Chinese leaders are working to invest in other forms of minilateral forums where they see those as both insurance and leverage in the broader competition or for a potential conflict. And so that is a sort of action reaction, self-reinforcing dynamic that I think is putting a lot of strain on the overarching inclusive institutions that the United States and China both belong to. That's not to say that there isn't effort at the United Nations to make progress on things like artificial intelligence, but I think that the bulk of effort still is placing this kind of almost centrifugal force, pulling the countries apart, despite the two countries' interest in stabilizing the relationship.
Yeah. Well, and it's obviously Taiwan is a critical part of this relationship. And I want to mention a foreign affairs article that you co-author with Bonnie Glaser and Thomas Christensen last year that, you argue that the US must reassure and not threaten China in order to deter China from invading Taiwan. Tell us what the main thesis was.
Well, the main thesis is that deterrence is a combination of threats and assurances, and that only investing in greater threats and military capabilities won't actually achieve effective deterrence. And this is advice that's directed, of course, at the United States, but it's true of all sides of this equation. Taipei, Beijing, and the United States in Washington, I think decision makers should realize that, going back to the famous theorist Thomas Schelling, that if you only invest in threats and don't make clear that these are conditional threats, that if the other side exercises some degree of restraint, they won't inevitably be punished or face the loss of their interests. And so it's not a blanket form of reassurance that we are suggesting. This is not the same as concessions or appeasement. Instead, it's making clear that if the other side does not move to change the status quo unilaterally, that the other sides won't either. Because without those kinds of assurances, all of the military saber rattling or demonstration of resolve won't actually be successful in bolstering deterrence.
Yeah, I think some people may argue that, between reassurance and deterrence, basically, these two, where's the sort of the right balance, right? Some people may argue that in the past there were too many reassurances, not enough deterrence, and now it needs to be different. Obviously, from certain people's point of view, there's too much threats, and so I want to come to Taiwan specifically, because you seem to think that the U.S. Has slightly changed its position. What makes you think so? And then second, what do you think has compelled the U.S. to make those changes, even though it claims that it hasn't? And third, what do you think a new administration's policy toward Taiwan should be?
Well, you're very much right that it's a difficult balance to strike, and people can perceive an imbalance when, in fact, we need to invest in both sides of the equation. And in the article, Bonnie Glaser, Tom Christensen, and I call for and support efforts calling on Taiwan to strengthen its sort of asymmetric self-defense, as well as the continued provision of American military equipment, et cetera, to Taiwan. At the same time, we also argue that it's really important not to suggest any change in American declaratory policy. There are some on Capitol Hill and that have suggested, a much more forward-leaning support for Taiwan's independence or sovereignty, which would mark a major departure from U.S. policy over the last 50 years. And President Biden, has suggested on numerous occasions when asked that the United States would fight for Taiwan, which of course is a possibility, but that sort of blanket statement, that unequivocal statement, would represent a move, which, I think that he and others think that this is important for signaling American resolve and will to fight. But they're missing a crucial ingredient, which is under what circumstances. And I think that it's important that the United States, whatever administration follows this one, continue to uphold a stance that makes both sides of this equation quite credible, which includes the efforts to discourage unilateral steps by either side, including on Taiwan, to change and make sort of clearer this sort of de facto, but perhaps even permanent separation. Those moves, in terms of changing the political status quo, are quite destabilizing if they're done unilaterally. And so it's that balance that I think is quite tricky, and I worry that many in Washington don't recognize the potentially destabilizing effect of their political statements in support of Taiwan.
Yeah, I think you mentioned the word perception, which is very important, obviously, in international politics. How does one side perceive the other side's move? And as you said, right, President Biden has said 4 times that he would help defend Taiwan, and now definition of helping Taiwan, supporting Taiwan, what does that mean? And of course, that how is that perceived by Beijing? Is that viewed as provocative, changing the position or not? Some people argue it's not. Some people argue it is. And so, same thing with Taiwan and China cross-strait relations is very dynamic and have become very tense in recent years. And it is undeniable that in Taiwan, people's identity and views of China have evolved over the years. And so, as a scholar, how do you explain this evolution? And do you think the cross relationship might change again?
Well, as you know, there have been major changes on the island since, there was the Civil War in the 1940s, and then, of course, the successful democratization of Taiwan, and simply that experience of decades of living entirely apart, and then Taiwan's thriving economy and society, has really, of course, created a natural shift in identity with generational change and turnover. And so the question is, to what extent can this continue to, what's the best way to protect this? And I think that there are those on Taiwan who are certainly hungrier for, greater international recognition, which is understandable. At the same time, we still live in the real world, and I think many of those who care a lot for Taiwan, including, my mother was raised in Taiwan, I think would like to be pragmatic about making sure that, again, balancing the need to resist Chinese efforts at intimidation and coercion, while also recognizing that pushing the envelope too far could bring down the very sort of coercion and even in the worst case, an armed attack that these efforts seek to avoid. And so it really is threading that needle and preserving what Taiwan has earned. That is, I think, a really important but also very difficult set of choices, as Richard Bush has noted.
Yeah, I think again, right, coming back to what is the right balance, as you mentioned, the ultimate, if the objective is to preserve Taiwan's current status, what is a better way to ensure its security? Is it more integration into international society, more recognition, or it's the other way? Again, this is obviously a heated debate in not only in Taiwan, but also on the US side and internationally.
I'd like to add that I think one of the most important things for all parties is to preserve the possibility of some future evolution that could, in principle, resolve the situation. I think when leaders or politicians on any side begin to feel that the clock is running out, that's when it could set in motion a really dangerous, set of beliefs and actions that could actually hasten or accelerate the slide towards conflict. So in some ways, kicking the can down the road, I think, is the best solution here, which is no solution, but still the best that we can do.
And the fact that you would raise that as a concern, does that mean you are concerned that currently the atmosphere does not allow for the conversation for potential unification or reunification?
Um, I don't think that the specifics here are the most important thing. What I'm trying to caution against is the fatalism. It's particularly, I think, dangerous when people in Washington start speculating about when, the invasion is going to take place. Is it in 2025 or 2027? That kind of unfounded speculation, I think, sets in motion and really freezes the possibility of finding diplomatic off-ramps or ways to simply, preserve space for continued discussion and diplomacy.
Can we just maybe focus on that a little bit? I think a lot of people would agree that, giving a deadline or a timeline is based on don't know what. However, there's definitely evidence that there's military buildup on the PRC side. And so how would you read this, right? Are they preparing to do something toward Taiwan? It's just a matter of time, or do you not think that the conversation of invasion is even necessary?
So I think that there are certainly the PLA is preparing, has been preparing, at least intensively since at least the 1990s, the series of crises across the strait. And because they felt very much at the time that given U.S. intervention, there is no military option. That said, having a military option, I think could be used both in their view to thwart a potential move toward independence, but it could also, I think, be, and this is what many fear, it could be a tempting target. Now, I think that the geography really favors Taiwan in this case, in the sense that this is a very, very difficult and would be enormously costly and maybe not even successful endeavor for Beijing to attempt. And so I tend to think that despite the rapid growth of Chinese military capabilities, this will still be what I think John Culver has called a crisis to be avoided rather than opportunity to be exploited. That said, one shouldn't take that for granted. And so I and others have supported both American and efforts on Taiwan to prepare for any, potential contingency to make it less likely. But it's very important to not then assume that, it's just a matter of time, because then that shuts down all of the diplomacy and other efforts to both focus on the near term kind of coercion that Taiwan faces, but also to try to stabilize the situation. And again, not that we are, imagining anything in particular, but to leave open space for Beijing, at least, to believe that, as they say in their rhetoric, that, oh, time is on their side. Well, whether it's on their side or not, it's important that all sides be able to sustain hope in a potential future, free of coercion.
Yeah, it's probably the most dangerous when neither side thinks time is on their side, or every side thinks time is not on their side. I want to shift the focus to the Asian American community, because you're obviously one of them. And that, a lot of people feel that the changing policy toward China, as well as obviously um, COVID has created this very negative view of China, just in general among Americans. And so, do you feel that on a personal level? And then in the meantime, while we're trying to distinguish, the Chinese government from the Chinese people and or Chinese Americans or Asian Americans in general is very hard, obviously, for people who are not of that heritage to make that difference. And so, yeah, on a personal level, just curious, how do you feel about it?
So it's a really important set of issues, and I'm really glad that you raised them. We certainly have seen a spike in anti-Asian violence, particularly during the spike in the COVID deaths here in the United States, but it continues. I personally have been relatively unscathed by this, but I mean, of course, there are, of course, chance encounters with this, to greater or lesser degrees. And I certainly know people who have been personally impacted, by this sentiment and what really often amounts to a kind of, racial or ethnic profiling, which is the real problem. Which is not that there aren't individuals who might be, doing things that are, nefarious, or corrupt, but that shouldn't be a basis for attributing wrongdoing or guilt to a whole class of people. And so I think when we need to, I mean, it's very difficult in part because of the Chinese Communist Party's efforts to, and concern in particular about the diaspora as a source of potential, political opposition to the Chinese Communist Party. And so the Asian American, Chinese American community, I think, is particularly sort of in the crosshairs here, caught
Yeah,
between. But it's incumbent on the United States and Americans to do better, I think, to
yeah,
make sure that as we find ways to, counter and mitigate the potential harms due to, espionage or whatever, that we not go overboard in, undermining the very kind of principles of non-discrimination that the United States stands for.
yeah.
So it's a challenging issue, but one that is just deserves a lot of attention.
Yeah, I think it is especially challenging these days when you have it's almost like the trend when the media is reporting on certain cases or issues. And it's become sort of almost like a popular topic now. And so it just makes everything much more complicated and challenging for anybody when you have, this perception of a nefarious Chinese Communist Party who's almost like the image of it is doing all these secret and very bad things in American society and implicated individuals also are Chinese Americans, right? And so it is very worrisome, but it's almost like, what do we do with it? And I definitely agree with you. I think the US government also needs to show some leadership. I want to ask the last question. Does China matter in the upcoming US elections? We know there's a very important presidential debate tonight in the US. Do you think China will come up?
I don't think that China looms very large in this election, in part because the Biden administration has been careful over the last 4 years not to take any actions that could possibly be construed as soft on China.
Hmm.
And so it may pop up here or there. I don't expect any specifics, particularly. I think there's a lot of attitude and underneath that, exactly what policies will be implemented by under either a candidate. I think there's a lot of room for speculation. Overall, I expect some kind of veneer of, we're going to stand up to China or we're going to win the 21st century, whether it's through tariffs or some other more targeted mix of controls on technology exports or et cetera. So I think it will probably appear briefly, but otherwise pretty much go by because, neither candidate, I think, will very much stick. But we'll have to see what happens.
Yeah. Well, maybe in some way it's a good thing that China is not the center of the conversation. But we hope to have you back. Thank you so much for having a conversation with us today, especially sharing a view that is not usually viewed as the dominant and mainstream Washington, D.C., very hawkish view toward China. Obviously, that's very important as well. So we hope to have you back, perhaps after the elections, so we know which administration is going to be in power. And at that time, there's going to be a lot of speculation of what a new administration's policy toward China will be. So thank you so much, Professor Chen Wise.
Thank you.